Muy buenos días a todos.
Good morning to everyone. I'm Lorena Tosan on behalf of CAF, Development Bank of Latin America. I would like to welcome you all to this fourth edition of the Dialogue Cycles for Policies for Post-Pandemic Recovery, a space where, together with very important guests and leaders in the region, we are discussing a series of documents drafted by CAF specialists and also consultants related with various areas of intervention, promoting an agenda of policies for economic and social recovery in Latin America once we overcome the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, in this meeting, which is strengthening the state capacities, the guests will be sharing some ideas oriented at designing policies that will allow to strengthen state capacities in order to achieve greater levels of efficiency and transparency in service management and also in executing investment projects. I also invite you to give us your opinion in social media. We are using hashtag Diálogos Postpandemia, hashtags Diálogos Postpandemia, and also follow CAF account at Agenda CAF, and Twitter will be there, and we'll be sharing your feedback through this to social media. To begin with, I would like to welcome and also give the floor to Antonio Silveira, Vice President of Infrastructure in CAF, who will be moderating today's sessions, both the presentation of studies as well as the debate on public policies. Welcome, Antonio. Good morning. Thank you, Lorena. It's always a great pleasure to be here with you in these dialogues for the post-pandemic recovery. This is a big effort on behalf of CAF in order to support our countries in the recovery, which presents a lot of challenges to a region that has been lagging for a long time. Today's session, we're going to be analyzing the strengthening of state capacities. Of course, the development is an interactive process between the private and public sectors. Of course, this is clear. We need to think about long-term development and at the same time simultaneously developing business capabilities and also innovation and state capabilities. Things need to be done simultaneously. And of course, we have a huge challenge in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is a region already characterized by a series of problems, even prior to the pandemic. And now they are highlighted even more. We need to promote recovery. I was watching the Doing Business 2020, and once again, we get information on the first page of the website that no Latin American economy is among the top 50 for doing businesses. Well, this is controversial. We know this. When I used to work at the World Bank, I participated in lots of discussions on this, but we need to consider all of this and take it into account. In today's session, we're going to have a first round with specialists from CAF, who also participated in drafting important studies related to strengthening state capabilities. Gustavo Fajardo, Mónica López, Sebastian Lopez, and Camilo Cetina. And in the second round, we will have the political dialogues with important policymakers as Carmen Valderrama, Vice Minister of Transport in Colombia, Luis Ricardo Oliva, General Manager of the National Authority for the Governmental Institute in Panama, and the Federal Secretary of Internal Control of the General Controllership in Brazil. So with no further ado, let's give the floor to Gustavo. Gustavo, what do you think are the most important dimensions that we need to work on in order to improve the governance of the public sector in the medium and long term, especially in terms of infrastructure? Hello, good morning, Antonio. Good morning to you all. Thank you very much for giving us the space. It's an honor to be here. And the document I wanted to talk about that we prepared in this series of documents after the pandemic. We were thinking about the fact that infrastructure or the public investment in infrastructure is an essential tool for the next few years in order to promote recovery, also knowing that we also have certain investment deficits in this regard, but also thinking that simultaneously there are some budgetary limitations to how much you can invest, and this causes for an increase in the efficiency of investments. I mean, getting more for what you invest. And in that sense, we have some dimensions where it's really very important to also invest in software and also the state capacities or capabilities in order to provide a greater efficiency. And maybe the main dimension has to do with planning of investment, basically. It's interesting that you mentioned this data on doing business, because this is one of the core points why it's important to invest in planning. I mean, having clearer rules and reduce uncertainties on the investments we need and the projects for the future. And a specific task in that regard has to do with increasing or strengthening the role of ex-ante assessments of projects in order to decide upon the projects in the pipeline. And the ideal thing is that potential projects might be systematically subjected to prospective studies that can estimate the social value and will allow for comparisons among different alternatives. It's very important that we try to collect that value through variables that also collect the well-being of people rather than the volume of consumption. And so we need to go slowly and working on adding all of this. This, of course, brings about the importance of complementary topics, one of which is, for example, to develop the capacity of executing bodies, especially in terms of national governments, which is preparing and formulating projects apart from the challenges in terms of implementation. So we talk about nationals because we know that they're responsible of a growing action of investment in public spending, and that's where we have many of the challenges that have to do with capacities for this task. Even though there is little evidence, the little evidence that we have is quite systematic, and talk about special difficulties of these governments, for instance, for formulating the right projects. There is a study that has been conducted for Chile that shows that among the investment initiatives that are being submitted to the Ministry of Social Development, those that are presented by municipalities are those that are less willing to get a favorable evaluation, and it has to do with that capacity to produce projects. Some other dimensions are, for instance, working on infrastructure, and it has to do with the design of tenders and contracts and trying to somehow get processes and contracts that are reducing the uncertainties that might be generated by counterparties, and also very well defining the settlement mechanisms. But so as not to take more time, I would also like to close with one last item that maybe we could speak about this further on, which of course has to do with criteria of transparency, which is another dimension transversal to governance, especially in the infrastructure sector. There's a lot of space to improve in terms of transparency of processes and of decisions that are made in the sectors that could bring about a better use of resources, because they facilitate the citizen monitoring as well as the state monitoring. But let me give you back the floor, and maybe we could talk about this later on. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gustavo. And I would like to mention 2 points that you touched upon. One has to do with the ex-ante assessment and also the training of implementing bodies, executing bodies, and also the relationship with the generation of data for planning and for public information in general. We know that transparency is a huge challenge in terms of infrastructure, not just because of the technical aspects, but also in order to avoid things such as cartels, etc., in tender processes. So I'd like you to talk about this relationship about assessment, trainment, and also the need to generate information and transparency. Sure. Honestly, transparency is something that is really very important among many other things. Many things have to be done, and you might think about 2 mechanisms through which transparency can improve or facilitate a better use of resources. First, and maybe is the one that we hear the most often, is to activate the citizen monitoring or surveillance that might prevent the bad use of resources. And in fact, there is some evidence of that. There are a couple of specific cases that I would like to mention that has to do with the use of platforms such as Mapa de Inversiones or Mapa Regalías in Costa Rica and Colombia, that I also mentioned this because they've also been assessed. And these are platforms that allow citizens to get very rich information on construction processes through georeferenced maps, and they give you a lot of information that is really very easy to share through the social media, for instance. And the assessments of these models prove that there are modest effects, true, but they are also positive on some index of physical and financial progress. Anyway, it's also very important to highlight that not all of transparency initiatives have effects through that regard. Sometimes it's difficult to get the citizens consume information and use it in an effective way. That's why it's important to continuously work on improving the way in which information is being spread, and also assess the impact of the initiatives in a continuous manner, or as much as you can. And also, the duties or the transparency practices can also improve the use of resources through a more straightforward path, which is that of the development of a follow-up capabilities of the state itself. For instance, within this Mapa de Inversiones and Mapa Regalías cases, there are some responsibilities that are defined for executing bodies to submit and update information on the progress made by the construction. And that, on the one hand, facilitates the task of controllers, but also it somehow forces executing bodies to develop protocols that would allow us to have an ongoing follow-up, as long as the responsibility of transparencies are very well defined, and as long as there are clear consequences in case of non-complying with those obligations. So one kind of tool that might also be important to highlight or mention here is that of the use of electronic platforms of procurement. We know that electronic procurement programs are quite common for the acquisition of goods and services, and as a next step in the evolution of their use is to implement them for work procurement. And the evidence that we have, I don't know the evidence for Latin America, but we do have evidence for the context of India and Indonesia, and we have very good effects for this kind of tools on efficiency indicators in terms of spending in all type of executing bodies that implement this in order to procure their works. Let me conclude by saying that somehow the good news is that in this dimension of transparency, I believe it's one of the areas of reform that it's relatively simpler to implement, Basically, because we at least have some models available on how to do it or not. There is a set of international standards that can also be used as a guideline to see what type of information we should be managing for each information projects and how to publish it and under which format. So these are standards. We have the COX, for instance, or the Open Contracting Data Standard, that relatively make the cost of its intervention cheaper because they give us a clear idea on the steps to follow. I think that with that, I'm right on time, and I'm here in case you have any other questions. Thank you, Gustavo. You are right on time. So Gustavo, he is a main economist of socio-economic research, and he has developed some studies on governance of infrastructure, which is really very important for the effort of recovery, and where governments and states have also a very important role. Let me now move on to my friend Monica Lopez. We know that the region has a huge pressure in terms of fiscal aspects, and within the infrastructure, one of the paths that almost all governments are doing is to leverage the public private partnerships, or PPPs. So in terms of governance, especially in the PPPs or the development of projects, what are the points that you would highlight as main points in this recovery effort?
Buenos días a todos. Sí, Tony, si bien en el documento hemos levantado varios, yo destacaría tres.
I would like to highlight three of them. The first one had to do with what Gustavo was saying. It has to do with planning. What we've seen with the government is that they say, we want to do private-public partnerships, but that might not be the first question. The first one is, what country do we want to have? What infrastructure do we want to have to build a country we need? And the third one is, how are we going to go about funding the infrastructure that we need with permanent, lasting game? And we see that these regulatory frameworks should understand one another, and they should be applicable not just from an investor's point of view. For them, that is a very clarifying view to come into a regulatory framework they know, but for public officials themselves, because we've realized that complex regulations cause the official himself or herself not to fully understand how to apply the regulation. That results in delayed times, and this backfires on the tool. We sometimes say the tool doesn't work, but maybe this is because good procedures have not been well defined. And along these lines, such as the regulatory framework, it should be applicable. It should be clear and understandable. It should not be subjected to interpretation, individual interpretation. The institutional framework is fundamental. PPP projects are more complex than those by ordinary tenders. They, as Gustavo was saying, they have the right teams. Sometimes they are wrong, and so technical training is of the utmost importance. When it comes to PPPs, we see that it is highly demanding. The majority of countries that approach us in order to request support from a CAF for PPP projects, all of them require technical training to be shared with the public servants. And that is where from CAF we've been working for the last 5 years along those lines. We created free courses online, created how those members will be trained, and it's not just establishing procedures and standard documentations. And this is another line where we focus on. And this is as far as I would like to cover, Tony. Thank you, Monica. You have already gone through the issue of institutional frameworks. And considering that almost all countries in the region have some sort of experience, some modality of a PPP, either by concessions or PFIs or whatnot, and considering the impacts of the pandemic, which we can very generally refer to. The big impact of pandemic in 2020 was that connectivity was physically closed all over the place, not just intra-regionally but international. And that, no doubt, has a high impact on transportation infrastructures. So in your view, which are the challenges after the pandemic is over, in the most immediate post-pandemic, when it comes to concession contract management in terms of PPPs? I would divide this into two different areas. On the one hand, we have the countries with the greatest maturity. They have a portfolio of projects that has already been executed or that is under execution. Those countries are bound to show that the model does work. And the COVID-19 pandemic will be a decisive factor when it comes to knowing how ready countries are in taking care of these unforeseeable events that show up the way and how to manage them. On the other hand, courts, arbitration courts, and agreements that can be settled between public and private sectors will be lessons learned that we will have to consider as important factors when it comes to defining public-private partnerships or contracts in the future. Countries with a longer track record on the subject matter are also changing. They are switching to other projects. Additionally to the traditional ones around transportation and energy, they are moving on to non-traditional sectors, more social sectors, and they are having some difficulty, even though working teams have a vast record of experience in airport concessions, in road concessions and whatnot. They are not that experienced in water and sanitation, water for irrigation, hospitals and prisons. And those areas present challenges because they also need to learn. We know that PPPs are tailor-made suits. And a one-size-fitting-all or copy-pasting is discouraged in PPPs. This is why you learn by doing. And this is why more mature nations are going on to sectors, and they need a learning curve. And we have the challenge of how these countries with greater maturity have a trickle-down effect on other countries in engaging in PPPs. PPPs have largely been done at a national level, but subnational agencies want to take advantage of the tool. There are challenges, and that is to create strong teams, have knowledge, and as we say, many times we don't have resources in order to make up teams like this. We need to get supported at a national level with teams that have that experience, such as the National Development Funding Agency. How is it supporting the national government in Colombia to fund this type of projects? And that is just one example. From the side of countries that are beginning, the challenge is in them understanding the infrastructure for PPPs. It takes time and it is costly. And in order for PPPs, you don't need all this structure. So I believe we need to exercise. We have to be sincere, coming to terms with saying, do we want to have a PPP program or do we want to have two of them in isolation? Because the countries will have to be bestowed with resources and define the institutional framework, and they will be quite different. We are walking along with countries under this phase, and it is important for them to well define where they want to be when it comes to PPPs, because the resources they will be needing are important if you want to do things right. And the path is one for the midterm. It is not for the short term. PPPs are never for the short term, and this is where we believe we have the challenge as well. Banks such as the Latin American Development Bank and other institutions can always walk hand in hand with parties to improve the framework and the vision that we have right now. Thank you so much, Monica. Monica, additionally to being my neighbor, she is the key officer at the Technical and Infrastructure Division of CAF. Additionally to coordinating lots of activities, she coordinates the PPP degree under CAF, and she's a specialist in the subject matter. Let's now move on to Sebastian Lopez. Sebastian, we were talking with Monica about the fact that the pandemic had an impact on physical connectivity, and it's been over for some time. Then it started recovering. Nonetheless, the other side of it has a lot of impact on digital connectivity. There is a contrary sense. There is a lot of pressure to amplify digital connectivity, and this involved not just in the private sector, but in the public sector, taking a look at processes and adjusting to these needs of digital connectivity. In this environment, which were the key reforms, which were the key lessons learned that we drew from the time of pandemic that could be leveraged on recovery? Thank you, Antonio. Thank you for this invitation. Greetings to the audience, to the online audience. On our paper, we emphasized a key concept that has to do with public governance for recovery, having the concept of a nimble governance. It being a concept that has been applied in the private sector for quite some time now, and it originates in software design, and this is quite related to how institutional design or governance relates to the final users, that is with citizens. So we emphasized on this concept of nimble or agile governance, one that is being implemented by OECD. And it is based on 3 lessons, 3 key aspects. They relate to simplification and digitalization. The first one, the relevance of co-creating public policies between the public sector in and of itself and with citizens. That is collaborative governance and co-creation. The pandemic showed the need for coordination as a key need to face challenges of such a nature. Another relevant aspect, to provide rapid solutions and incremental improvements, to design and at the same time to implement. And that generates some resistance, some reluctance in traditional people who are so much used to processes and to timelines that are quite different from other timelines. Then focus on continuous improvement. Once the public policy or a next product is implemented, well, teams that were in charge of implementation have to constantly review and revisit efficacy. These are 3 key relevant aspects that characterize many governments in the region, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, and they relate to the concept of governance, agile governance. Some specific examples that can help. This idea of beginning to, rather than focusing on regulations that are mandatory and that impose punishments, to go the other way around, that is to lay down or create soft log guidelines based on incentives, and that this will have an impact on change in the behavior of citizens or companies. Also, the idea of experimental implementation. Many governments in the region created in Argentina the system of simplified associations. It took 6 months to file them in record, and it can now be done in 48 hours. This is a system based on nimble methodologies such as Scrum, working as a team in the government and with citizens to implement and generate enhancements. Brazil's experience. in the user's journey, that is, the user's experience, how each landmark in the implementation is related to the feedback and to perceptions among users in connection to public policy being implemented. This is the gov.br initiative. There's a key challenge here, namely how to include in the public administration champions that will be devoid of the traditional mechanisms of the public administration in the timelines, and that based on these, they have mechanisms available for creating agile public policies with the citizens at the core, thinking about solutions to problems. This is the main challenge, how to turn the public administration, the traditional one, and at the same time attract talent and people who think outside of the box, who think in a creative manner with a focus on the citizens. This is the north for the regulatory frameworks that come to existence in the future. Citizens as the focus of regulation. Thank you, Sebastian. This is a very interesting focus that you've mentioned, and these experiences of having sandboxes where we may generate innovative issues around citizen services. We know that countries in the region are by and large based on the Roman law, with very fundamental codes for public action. Taking a look at these innovation needs in this transition to the digital society on the part of the government, which are the key reforms that you envision necessary in order to deliver on this background? We know that the government can only do what is written because of the public law framework that we have. On the other hand, this path towards the digital society requires enormous flexibility, much the way you stated. So which are the main reforms that you see necessary? As I said in the beginning, these three aspects are ones that have to do with necessary reforms, i.e. to turn the administration into something that my boss, the Digital Nation director, talks about: administration in a startup, a public administration that shouldn't be reactive to demands, but rather proactive, that should integrate itself with officials that think in terms of policies based on citizens that have leeway to do so. And there is a key aspect which I believe will be discussed later, and Panama here made a very good job of it. Indeed, they were awarded among 13,000 organizations that characterized, well, based on the collaborative experience between the government agency and the Ministry of Health, how they faced the COVID-19 pandemic. And it has to do with coordination in the public sector. Coordination in the public sector is a key issue. It's been so in the last 15 years. And the pandemic exposed it in a key manner because it presented a very down-to-earth need for collaboration to be there in the public sector. Digital transformation is a cross-section initiative. The more benefit you get from digital transformation processes is when these initiatives are led from the top level authorities at the government and they trickle down to different levels of the public sector. Why have many attempts failed in coordinating between the public sector? It's because they haven't been bestowed with key elements, efficacy of this coordination for making progress in digital transformation. The first issue, a shared vision. It is important for there to be a shared vision of government in connection to where we are heading for. Monica Lopez was making a point of it, PPPs being a means rather than an end in itself. Strategies and methods have to be defined, and based on this, coordination efforts should be determined. A second key point, maybe the most important of them all, incentives. Coordination has to be promoted and it has to be incentivized. Coordination cannot be forced upon. This being true both in the public and private sectors. if I will create a center of government in a given country, and I want for officials who are the second line in command who will contribute to the success of coordination, I need to incentivize them so that their agendas are functional to that coordination, that is based on incentives. When I was an official myself, we said we want the snapshot of success, but everyone to be on the photo, not just the one that faces, that has the forward facing view. And these points should be respected across the entire supervision process, coordination in the public sector.
So incentives and shared vision as part of a coordination strategy should be constantly respected because it's the main sign from the center of government to officials so that they can react to this strategy and, of course, reviewed and improved. I don't want to get, we do have the different initiatives of digitalization and simplification of paperwork. In fact, CAF has published many case studies in the case of Mexico, Colombia. You all know this, but I do believe it's important to focus on how and on critical aspects that have to do with the success of these reforms, which has more to do with how the state gets organized to achieve these goals rather than digitization in itself. So I conclude with that. I hope I've answered your question. Thank you very much, Sebastian. He's head executive of the Digital Innovation Directorate for CAF. And last for this blog, and of course, very important as well, also we have Camilo Cetina, my office neighbor. So, Camilo, a very direct question. What are the main challenges in terms of digital transformation for governments in Latin America after the pandemic? We're developing a very important aspect together with Sebastian, but of course, there are some important challenges ahead, and you are a specialist here, so not just as a specialist in CAF, but in your past life as well. I would like to hear you talk about this. Well, thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you for the invitation. And let me greet all the colleagues who have joined us. We classified this document divided into 3 areas. The first challenge is to recognize and to further exploit the value of data. That is, the community perceive understanding the virus, understanding the behavior. That presented a challenge to such an extent that if you observe, and we had kind of a register of searches of coronavirus in Google, and there were over 2.3 billion results in March, April, and May. Today, if you find that out, maybe it's less than 2 billion results. So the amount of information that we had to collect was really huge, and one of the best defense in terms of data was a possibility of sharing and opening data. That is to say, when the various governments or epidemiological authorities already start sharing information, they already start sharing the results that they get through their studies, and at the same time, the studies they have on the behavior in terms of virus infection, then the understanding that the community had on the problem is accelerated. We reduce the phenomena of lack of information, or at least they get balanced, and we start having a more qualified reaction from the public policy point of view in terms of isolation, and also in order to reduce infection and health emergency. And on the other hand, this value of data has also to do with economic recovery. We don't have an opening of information about the public spending, about public procurement in recovery times, about public policies, what you were mentioning, or what Sebastian was mentioning, record on the licitations and permits and regulations in order to follow certain guidelines in terms of the state over markets. So if we are unable to open that information, the recovery will get more difficult, because this also implies mechanism of co-creation, of collaboration, of cooperation among the public and private sector. So this is the first big lesson that we get. The second lesson of this phenomenon has to do with the fact that once you recognize the value of data, which was the first lesson, the second lesson is the reuse of data, especially through artificial intelligence technologies. Data per se is not enough. We need to reuse that information and generate an added value or an additional value, so to speak. So we get phenomena of telemedicine, tele-education, chatbots, on predictive phenomena in order to see where we could have future focus of infection in relation to economic recovery. So AI becomes a very important mechanism in order to reuse that information, in order to help a state react in an easier way in terms of care for citizens. The fact that reality in terms of social contact has changed, this also implies that the state needs to simplify a big amount of paperwork, eliminate physical contact and paper, and be more agile. This also implies the reuse of data, and again on AI technologies that allow to make certain paperwork and processes more automatic and without need of having a human intervention. So this is the second big lesson that we get. And the third big lesson that comes, let's say, in two areas. One is the use of AI in terms of fight against corruption, the discretionality of spending, discretionality in public procurement, invoking the manifest urgency. So this generated some sacrifices in terms of transparency. So I believe that AI has to do with the reuse of data also as an alternative to identify risks of corruption based on various applications and platforms. But given this new reality that we have right now, it's important that states begin to consider the public procurement of AI. By this I mean that it needs to be very structured, very much regulated, as what we see in the cases of Monica and Gustavo, that has to do with infrastructure procurement. When you hire infrastructure, it's not buying paper or something like that. We need some technical studies, and we need audited processes in order to those crises bring about opportunities for a lot of innovations. But we also know that once crises are overcome, this innovative climate trickles down. So your experience in CAF and previous as a manager on transparency and information, what do you think are the lessons that we need to highlight so as not to lose this opportunity in the future? One of the things I would say is that transformation in the way we relate as citizens with the state has changed, and in fact in the way we relate with many institutional constructions, how we relate with education, the face-to-face education might not be so necessary. Also in terms of health, of course, that won't be so necessary. Also what has to do with face-to-face processes. Also, before justice, there are a lot of public goods that have now changed. Thanks to this post-pandemic time, we learned that technology could help us in many various aspects. So I believe that that big lesson is how to use this technology in favor of more aggressive simplification and also better quality of life for citizens. So I think that there is an important challenge ahead there. So just to give you an example in terms of education, even though we know that a face-to-face education is not so fundamental, we do need a certain level of contact in order not to degrade the quality of life of that user. And the same thing is going to happen in different aspects in terms of institutions that we've developed. And also what has to do with integrity and transparency, I would extrapolate that argument to that we need to understand that the change generated by COVID, that removal of being present, forces us to relate information in a more anticipatory manner. This means that technology, data technology in terms of use for fighting corruption needs to be built based on that predictive philosophy or preventive philosophy, having more risk mitigation especially. And this is important also due to the effects and the way in which the economic recovery policy is being built. We've lost many resources recessions have been quite severe in Latin American countries, and so recovering the levels of employment, recovering the levels of productivity will be something really very complicated if the investments done by the state, the fiscal effort that is being done for economic recovery, runs short of transparency and accountability. The state needs to be accountable, and an important part of the mechanisms that allow for that accountability and corruption risk prevention is in technology. I don't need to get citizens in an auditorium to show them what I did as a governor, but I can send them text messages and give them information through their emails and inform them about the management in terms of recovery. I would say that those are the true fronts where we won't be losing momentum based on the pandemic. Thank you very much, Camilo. Camila, he's a head executive of the Digital Innovation Directorate from CAF also. So we have Camilo, Gustavo, Monica, and Sebastian, who talked about various aspects about the strengthening of state capabilities, also touched upon public investment, PPPs, everything that had to do with digitization and different processes, and data opening, transparency, among other things. So in the next block, we will be listening to very important policymakers that will be talking about this based on their experience. But let me go back to Lorena. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Antonio, and all the specialists who were here. It's been a pleasure listening to you. And also, let me tell you, those of you who are joining us in this event, that the studies are available. You might find them by entering in sinotecap.caf.com. There you will have all these studies to be downloaded, and you can also share your feedback with us. Let me remind you through the social media with hashtag Diálogos Postpandemia, and follow us through the official Twitter account at AgendaCAF. We will be joining you with all of your feedback. So let me also invite you to our next meeting. Let me go a little bit ahead in what we'll be listening for this cycle for post-pandemic recovery, and we'll be talking about fiscal institutions and sustainability of public debt through the website www.caf.com, and social media. You will be able to get all the information and sign up and know everything you need to know for our next encounter. So up next, we will continue discussing about public policies, and let me give the floor again to Antonio Silveira. You have the floor. Thank you, Lorena. And now, during this block, we'll be listening to very important speakers. I won't take much time with their resumes. One, because you might easily find them in internet, and second, because they are so rich that I'm going to waste a lot of time here. So we really want to listen to their own experience and how they can take the most from all of this. So now we will have the Vice Minister of Transport in Colombia, Carmelita Valderrama. She's a lawyer. He has a master's in business law and very important participation in the Colombian public sector as a regulator, as a superintendent of defense for competition. Also has experience with international organizations. Well, a very rich resume. I recommend you to look at in the internet. Also, Ricardo Oliva, administrator of the National Authority for Panama, recognized as one of the governments that have a very good performance in terms of state innovations. And last, the Federal Secretary of the General Controllership in Brazil, Antonio Carlos Becerra. So I will begin with Carmen. Good morning, Carmen. It's a pleasure having you with us. Colombia has an impressive initiative in terms of PPPs, and we are going from the financial closures of 4G and looking forward to 5G. So what do you think was the main source of confidence that the government of Colombia had in order to attract the confidence of investors, even in a situation of pandemic as the one we had? Thank you very much. And first of all, excuse me for taking a couple of minutes to appreciate the time given by CAF so that we can share our experiences from Colombia. In relation to what we've experienced in terms of infrastructure and the pandemic, the challenge has been quite big, as probably is the case for the rest of you. Antonio, let me greet Carlos Oliva and Carlos and Becerra Jimenez, who are with me in the panel. Colombia, just as the rest of the countries, as was also mentioned before in the previous interventions, did not have an accurate response on how to react in view of the pandemic. And of course, in terms of our sector, the transport sector, but also in general terms as a country. So the measures that were taken were trying to verify that all possible variables, where the main one was health, could answer the needs of the country. At that time, by March 2020, we had quite a favorable economic situation as a country compared to our neighboring countries. And that was giving us a big momentum. I mean, the illusion of being able to be more consolidated and consolidate the infrastructure of the country. So the first decision was isolation, generating an isolation for all sectors except for the transportation sector. So, and also in relation to transporters. So the infrastructure was paralyzed. We had to isolate it until we learn how to continue moving forward. So what we did was not to stop load transport, which was the one that supplied us. And so we guaranteed the supply for the country, and very quickly, and taking some very detailed biosafety protocols, one of the first sectors that was reactivated was that of infrastructure. So I would especially highlight that evolution in governance of the country in the last few months and years, in 2020, 2021, in that challenge in relation to this also challenge presented by the pandemic, and also reactivate infrastructure, as was mentioned before. It reactivates not just a country in important connectivity conditions, but in our case, in a very important case in terms of employment, because the number of people that start working with all of these projects has a very positive impact in the country, and with a characteristic that we permanently support, which is thinking the whole national territory, especially those regions that are not specifically focused on large cities or the capital city, what has to do with the development of infrastructure, but on the whole national territory. So this added to the fact that we already had a very important reactivation policy to overcome contingencies and conflicts that we've experienced. This is what has allowed us to move forward in terms of infrastructure in Colombia and also obtain the results that we are now having. Let me also mention the citizen participation during these processes and also the transparency. This was also mentioned a couple of minutes ago in the previous block. Antonio mentioned this very accurately. The importance in these large projects, in these macro projects, of engaging citizens and generating an absolutely transparent information. This is what we've been doing during this administration, strengthening the institutionality and governance, but also in an articulate manner together with all the rest of the sectors, including the citizen engagement, which was strengthened with a very specific figure, which is that of citizen monitoring or surveillance offices, or veedurías as we call them. So this is where we generated this figure, veeduría ciudadana, that support the process, that they get to know the process and also obtain all the information about the evolution of infrastructure. This, of course, generates transparency and also accessing public information. This also marked an important hallmark. Learning about projects was not possible unless we asked for some requests and some additional requests for citizens. So today, any program could be signed up in a public registry and also get to know all of the projects, what is the status, what's their evolution, and that also allows for having some confidence on what's going on in terms of development in infrastructure in Colombia. The National Infrastructure Agency has had the leading role here, and their responsibility is generating this kind of progress. And together with authorities in the sector, also generating this sense of confidence for investors through strengthening these policies of institutional governance, so that, for instance, we've achieved the support of Frondoe and CAF together with the purpose of supporting the formulation of corporate governments that would also improve standards and administrative processes in order to achieve the OECD standards that right now is a big challenge ahead. As a consequence, we've strengthened the we've modified the board, we've generated some measures, also improve reporting, and we have some measures in terms of sustainability. So, to close, all of these items that I mentioned really fast, but I would like to say that the final front of our strength is having a policy of compliance. And as long as we comply, we all win. Of course, the country wins, citizens win, contractors who are making an important bet on the country also win, and authorities also win in terms of governance and credibility. So compliance has also become an important obsession to us, not just for contract effects, but because we firmly believe that with that we can achieve our goal to give a response to citizens, generating this environment of confidence for investors, and also generate consolidation of governments for the country. So the implementation of all of these elements as a government in terms of sustainability allow us to keep on moving forward in this concept in a positive way, and through the track. And also highlighting something else, we also want to continue working on the equal representation of men and women in various positions in different institutions. This is very important in Colombia. And just now, from the ministry, we have female ministers, two female vice ministers, and percentages are over 50%. So all of this adds in order to share what you were asking, Antonio, about what I would like to highlight specifically about the evolution of governance that as a minister and as Annie we've had in order to maintain confidence of investments in Colombia.
Carmen, y un destaque ahí es que nuestro nuevo presidente.
Thank you for your reply. Our new president, who started over yesterday, called upon our attention the need to do this at the top management of CAF, especially considering what Colombia is going through in the transportation sector. Along these lines, part of the topics there of, institutionalization, trust of investors, Colombia is well known on it. The pandemic caused a few important impacts in terms of infrastructure in the private sector, in contracts that were already underway. And I would like to hear from you two things. On the one hand, how did you go about managing this at a Colombian government level? What is your experience in the transportation ministry? We know how Annie acted. And also, the lessons in this process. How did the planning change and eventually project prioritization at a national level? Thank you. Thank you for your question, Antonio. Well, a lot is connected to what I already answered in the prior reply. In view of the pandemic, the first decision to be made by the government is that of isolation, the lockdown. It was necessary to quickly reactivate, as all countries. We couldn't leave the situation under the status quo. We had to assess biosafety protocols and the guarantees that needed to be in place for investments to take place in infrastructure. The decision was to adopt a thorough, rigorous protocol for the infrastructure sector. In Colombia, we adopted an exclusive protocol for this sector, where the entire chain, all participants of the activity of construction for infrastructure, we would have special commitments to honor. I should also highlight that the protocol was built together with parties as well, in such a way as consolidating the protocol allowed us to quickly react vis-a-vis the staticity that was created in connection to infrastructure. Additionally to that, this helped the country with the reactivation of works in connection to COVID-19. In July, August, 108,000 direct employments were generated, 45% more work than was active even at the beginning of the pandemic. Why was this generated? Well, inter alia, when progress was made in infrastructure, we required to make changes in highways and mobility. This will necessarily have an impact on community. Being the community at a lockdown, we turned this difficulty into an opportunity. We knew we could make progress on the works far more efficiently, so that was what we ventured for. We turned that difficulty into an opportunity. For that reason, we can talk about this figure in terms of employment, which again, there's 45% more than were available in the beginning of the pandemic. From that date on, up until the year 2020 was finished, we had a peak that exceeded 190,000 employments in Colombia, only based on this sector. in such a way that the transportation sector, especially that of infrastructure, has been, we can say without a doubt, fundamental for the economic recovery. In the investment that this sector is having has triggered a strengthening, a productive one, not just because of the generation of employment, but also because of the large numbers of supplies that are required in this sector in such a way that industry, commerce, private sector, social sectors, and built in connection to the pandemic. These allowed us better and greater per capita income in the region, poverty reduction and greater life quality, which is the primary purpose of the government to enable development and growth. Thank you so much, Carmen. We've heard Carmen Valderrama, the Deputy Minister of Transportation from Colombia. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Sacar mucho provecho
Indeed, we will...
de las informaciones que nos pasan. Y seguimos en nuestro programa. Hablamos ahora con Luis Oliva, de la Autoridad Nacional de Innovación Gubernamental de Panamá. Buenos días, Luis, ¿cómo estás? ¿Todo bien? Mire, a Panamá fue reconocido internacionalmente ahora en 2021 como un ejemplo de manejo de los complejos flujos de trabajo en la emergencia global de la pandemia de COVID-19, por un trabajo muy cercano entre la AEG y el Ministerio de Salud. ¿Tú podrías describir a nosotros los factores de éxito de este esfuerzo que se implementó en Panamá?
Along these efforts implemented in Panama, could you please illustrate us on this? Thank you so much. As a matter of fact, I will get started by talking about the fact that for us to manage synergy between an authority of global implementation, the agency in charge of regulating public policies in modernization of the state, well, I could say that there always is a preliminary impact, a first one, that is reluctance to change. During the process, the pandemic process, we got started with the Ministry of Health by trying to carry forward communication with the greatest number of channels available at a technology level and at social media levels. Nonetheless, once the pandemic was over, will be over, the system was once the pandemic struck, the system was not ready to deal with the number of COVID cases that were coming. We are an international hub, and since we had so many entries to the country from passengers from all over Latin America, we had to make a decision, one of identifying and tracing COVID cases that were detected in the region. Part of what we were after was to change the way in which the Ministry of Health would normally operate, introduce the technological component to avoid collapsing the healthcare system through WhatsApp and through other channels, whether you call them Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, you name them. We used all these media that Panamanians use to identify people with symptoms or people who could turn positive for COVID. We were one of the first countries in the world to have used these tools through a bot that was working on AI to identify, according to the different symptoms that people had, to give priority to those that had greater chances of being positive for COVID, considering factors as to whether they were in close contact with a person that traveled from a country of risk, whether the person had symptoms that were similar for COVID, among other measures. So the system prioritized, and with 20 physicians, we took care of plus 2,500 patients daily. Each one of these physicians took care of a significant number of patients, but they were already pre-screened by the tool, especially because data was already made available to them. They saved a lot of time. They just focused on diagnosis. Once the physician identified the patient required to be transported or visited at home, this was linked to an operations center, 911, that had built-in technology whereby we could prioritize on cases, and also, depending on the geographical location of people, we could optimize the resources that were nearby located. Even when they belonged to different regions, they could take care of people with that priority, considering that COVID is a virus that requires to be taken care of urgently to avoid complications. So at the outset, with the Ministry of Healthcare, we started this way. We then provided traceability, integration of all systems, taking into consideration that for COVID, time is of the essence. And right in the beginning, when systems were not integrated, a person could be diagnosed 9 days after having been positive for COVID, considering that during all that while the person could have disseminated the virus during all that while. So we integrated all labs, whether public or private in the country, for COVID tests, reducing the time, the turnaround, to less than 24 hours. It is online and it is integrated to epidemiological surveillance system. This allowed us to flatten the curve, the contagion curve that we had. Additionally, we integrated based on mobile phones. We were the first country in the region to integrate the express notification system embedded on mobiles. iPhone and Google were our partners, and a notification got sent to each one of the mobiles of Panamanians so they would activate the notification, and so that we could get started with a traceability process that would be paired with COVID response. So I can say that all these things that we did during traceability generated a lot of trust in the system. We had reluctance to change, initially by emergentologists that were in charge of primary care. We strongly introduced virtual visits, and then we had to go and work with epidemiologists. Initially, when they were provided these tools, they were reluctant to the change, but then each one of them turned a sponsor on our side. They helped us so that at the upcoming phase, vaccination in and of itself, they started a process. We started it in November 2020, 3 months before the first shipment of vaccine arrives, with the view that we had to carry identification and traceability of COVID cases together with vaccination in order to provide information to the President of the country and the Minister of Health where the COVID clusters were and where we needed to prioritize vaccination cases to bring down mortality cases. This is the strategy that we used. Others increased production or immunizations in the more productive age groups. However, our approach was to try to reduce lethality and serious disease, taking into consideration that we could develop a strategy in an environment where the use of information for decision-making purposes got a lot of preponderance internally in the government. The Ministry of Healthcare took decisions based on this, and strategically it had an incidence on the populations where the immunization was underway. This was why we were one of the countries we managed to stop in one single day. Almost 2% of the population got immunized in one single day. We've had several days in a row having such a high level of immunization, and that is part of the effort that was undertaken with the Ministry of Health. But that was truly by establishing policies where the population that were in greatest need, those that hadn't been immunized, and that helped us optimize resources. Additionally to this, we included the COVID vaccination card, and we have a sport event coming soon where we have a turnover of 80% of people for the match, where everyone will have to show their QR code in a mandatory basis to show vaccination certification, and only those who have a full schedule of vaccination will be allowed in. This was started. We came close to citizens so that citizens would trust electronic platforms. And today, economic reactivation continues to use platforms in order to protect and in order to stop people from having COVID contagion to be in other places, causing potential infections. Thank you so much, Luis, and I apologize because I was so eager to hear from you. I didn't say who you were. You have a degree in electronic technology. He's a teacher in project management and has experience in USH, among others. This pandemic experience was quite impressive in Panama, I should say. And I say so because I live in Panama. I've had the chance to experience this firsthand. How is your regard? How about this innovation effort? And how about the possibility of expediting digital transformation whereby CAF is fully involved? It's not just having a data center in Panama, but also providing support to a number of actions. What is your take? What are the institutionality and regulation challenges that Panama has in order to keep moving forward in such a remarkable background that you've covered over the last few years? That's a major challenge, especially so because part of reluctance to change, as I have mentioned so much so far, has always gone hand in hand with our large need for trained human resources, especially as part of the institutions. We saw that countries, industrial nations, they do have up to 10% of their state roster are people who are focused on ICTs, pretty innovative when it comes to having skipped a few stages of electronic government, and we are focusing much more now on end-to-end proceedings, and that allows us to skip some parts of the process with a lot of implications of human resources that have been doing the same old stuff for the last 40 years, and they are the ones that are less open to change. So we assessed processes and we tried to have a better incorporation, considering that citizens in the pandemic had a great access to platforms. And we can say that 1 every 2 Panamanians has carried out already one proceeding with the government through our platform. We have a single website, panamadigital.gov.pn, and we are thrilled that in the last 2 years we moved from having 346,000 people who in 15 years have used one proceeding, and in 2 years' time we came down to 1.5 million people that use this platform. This is probably one of the per capita cases that is highest in the region in connection to using technology platforms. And this has been thanks to the acceleration brought about by the pandemic at a point where the country had the greatest restrictions in Latin America in connection to mobility. We were focused on having to provide as a state services to citizens in a digital manner, and citizens were bound to go for it. And so we have now citizens that are more digitally literate, no matter how old they are. And we are using this today to train a great deal of people. We've trained in the first month of a strategy. We want to train those that have been underemployed following the pandemic. We have trained 250,000 people in one single month. This is equivalent to over 5% of the population in one single month, providing additionally an economic relief of $120 plus online training that was accessible to free of charge internet while the platform was being used. All the strategies go hand in hand. Citizens should be using government strategies and platforms. They should be comfortable. It is fundamental for them to get acquainted with it. We need to carry out all proceedings in a digital manner, but there's no point in that if citizens don't use them. And then proceedings should move digitally with the greatest possible interoperability and with the competencies inside the government in order to provide support. And let me give you some information here. We only had 1.4% of our proceedings digitalized by 2019. It had been quite a difficult task for the prior administrations. Our goal for 2024 is to have 60% of all proceedings online. So it's a big step forward. Today, almost 5% of proceedings are online, and this is 4 times what we had once we came in. But these are end-to-end. Citizens don't need to go to the office, and that's the strategy we have implemented.
Thank you very much, Luis. A very good experience and all the success for that Panama example. Now I'll turn into Portuguese in order to talk a little bit with Antonio Carlos Becerra Leonel, Secretary of Internal Control of CGU in Brazil. Antonio Carlos, he has a bachelor in business. He worked in the financial market for 7 years, and since 2002, he's been part of CGU, where he joined as Auditor for Finances and Control, the famous AFC, as we call it. Good morning. It's a pleasure talking to you. So before we get into the post-pandemic, let's talk a little bit about government's reaction in relation to the pandemic. And what we do know is that the emergency has been general, and governments had to react very fast vis-a-vis an existential threat, let's put it this way. And this led us to a series of actions, emergency actions, that of course generate huge challenges in terms of control, integrity. So I wanted to start by listening to the Brazilian experience in relation to the pandemic and how was the CGU reaction, how was your work complicated, and how do you maintain excellence in everything that has to do with this situation that occurred worldwide. So, Antonio, you have the floor. Thank you very much. I would like to thank you for the invitation. I've been listening to the other speakers, and that's already something very important. So thank you very much for your invitation. And in fact, what we need to reinforce are structural aspects. CGU, in terms of public policy, fosters and supports all the initiatives of public policies that are institutionalized. Since 2019, we have created a system of evaluation of public policies headed by the Ministry of Economy today, and this has been in for a while. Since 2015, the Brazilian government has created this structure, and we've already been able to assess 1.3 trillion reals in public policies, 46 public policies. We have a priority map. The CGU is part of this effort. But we need also to consider the Ministry of Economy that has many bodies, the National Treasury, the Fiscal Authority. So we need to consider that this is a governance aspect that has evolved in the last few years and that we believe helps a lot to fight any deviations as well, because with a well-assessed information in order to address the pandemic. So we made a huge effort together with some other states, but also with all of the states and municipalities with over 26,000 inhabitants. So this has been a huge effort because this information was not digitized. This is a country that, as I said before, is a federation, and we did not have just one single procurement panel, including that information. And today, with the update of the national procurement law, we are building this panel. But during the pandemic, it did not exist. So the local manager found it difficult to make a follow-up. They procured masks or face masks without really knowing the exact price or with variable prices. But with that panel, and even with the dynamic of a price rise of supplies due to the coronavirus pandemic, even with those increases in prices, at least we had a benchmark. And so this was a very important effort. And the CGU ended up spearheading this panel with the help of some states, and in fact it was really very important for the decision-making process. And of course we had also an emergency support program to support the population with 300 trillion reals approximately, in order to provide support to those who lost their income during the pandemic. And we were able to fight many deviations as well. We also had a very successful program, and there was a deviation of many reals, and within that we had some members that were not within a program. They were not just frauds, but they were not fitting within the different programs. And so that support, that help, would include a great part of the Brazilian population, approximately 60 million people, to provide information to justice in order to find fugitives or outlaws. And in this case, we had 5,000 outlaws that were found thanks to the support, to the subsidy, because we were able to exchange information with local police. And another important effort was that of the incentive to employment permanence. This was an emergency benefit that was provided to businesses so that employees were not laid off. So this was also a very significant program around ¿Me cortó?
Essas pessoas não caíram na rede de assistência social dois programas que estão focados na questão do financiamento do empresário. Para manter o fluxo de caixa das empresas, era essencialmente manter o fluxo de caixa das empresas e essas empresas terem fôlego para se manter mais tempo no mercado. E, junto com isso...
And together with that, the central bank carried out a very important measure, more than 1 trillion of reals released to banks in order to help the country not to fall so much. Of course, the Brazilian economy fell minus 4.1% of the GDP, and it was not a very good number, but considering the scenario, it could have been much worse. Thank you very much, Antonio. And considering now the post-pandemic scenario and the previous measures, considering the change in the competition law and the administrative situation, and also the CGU was trying to reach some agreements in order to have the capacity to have an influence, at least in the judicial sphere, but with different instruments that Brazil introduced during the government. And this was a law where they were foreseeing agreements of that nature with legal security, but also a very important argument among the different control organizations and the public ministry, considering who would lead these leniency agreements. And finally, the CGU has a very important role in the consolidation of justice. So I would like for you to tell me a little bit about how was to introduce this mechanism and also the strategy of the CGU for this mechanism, especially considering the infrastructure and how we have a region that has suffered a lot from crisis before the pandemic, integrity crisis that generated different effects in very different countries, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, a very large number. So I wanted to hear from you, your experience in the CGU, and how is the strategy that you are implementing now, considering the legal aspect in this situation? Well, Antonio, this is an important aspect because when you go to the U.S., the anti-bribery in the U.S. took a lot of time to be issued. And here in Brazil, it was a shock treatment. It was created, and then we had the Lava Jato operation that made us actually gave us like a PhD in this matter in only 2 years. And so it was a shock. Yes, now it's a little bit, it's more clear. Now we have the Brazilian courts that are very much working, and they know how important the CGU is in this matter. And it is obvious that when we identify this, for example, today we are always working with the General Union organization and sometimes with the Federal Public Ministry. So this is a situation. We can work with these partnerships in a very good way, and it is worth mentioning that the leniency text or context included frustration by the control organizations, especially the CGU, because we had records and we had these companies that were taking into this record of companies that were shown to be not good, and actually they went bankrupt. And it took years for us to get something about that. And the return was quite low without considering other things, and how fighting corruption in order to know what is happening, because companies are not always under corruption. We didn't have data to leverage those operations, and the lack of commitment of those companies that went bankruptcy. So with this leniency agreement, we can weigh with this. First, improving the situation of deviations in the state, because we were having a level of recovery that was from 5 to 10%, and now we are going to 60 to 65%. And we can have a faster recovery and less expensive for the state. And the second aspect that we can do is to leverage the situation of goodwill and understand what is happening and what were the officers that were corrupted. And we also need to see what happened with those deviations, with those money issues. For example, those agreements that also prevent, those agreements also in terms of training the auditors and showing how these deviations took place. So companies know more about this, but even more important is this integrity plan for the company that would be there during the implementation of this plan by the CGU. So this way we can see very positive issues related to this. And in terms of changes, we are fostering a cultural change. Many of these companies were trying to put away the controllers for this integrity plan, and let me tell you that we were in a very terrible scenario where the fight against corruption would only generate lack of employment because all companies were going bankrupt, and actually they were not even getting private loans because the private banks didn't know if they were able to give them money. But now these companies are punished in a different way. Because what happens is that the company can keep on working, paying what they have to pay to the state and cooperating with the investigation and also with a cultural change ahead. Because if we can attack this, we can deal with what is happening now, and we can also deal with future issues. So this was a great improvement, and you can see the results that speak for themselves. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. This is truly a set of information and experiences that is very rich for the region and also for our work as a development bank, bringing best practices to the table. So, now,
Tuvimos la oportunidad de tener
closure, we had the chance of having from executives of the CAF with their vision and how they organize the topics that have to do with public investment and innovation in the sphere of governments. And we also had a panel of policy managers where Carmen showed the institutionality issues and the planning issues in Colombia. Finally, Antonio Carlos showed us how with internal control we can have evolution in terms of transparency, in terms of agility, and in terms of integrity in the public administration.
Of course, all of this is part of some of the basics of state capacities that we are offering to everyone. Lorena, I will now give you the floor for the closing remarks. Thank you very much. Thank you, Antonio. It's a pleasure listening to each and every one of you joining us during this meeting. Let me thank you once again. It's been a very enriching moment for all participants. And before we leave, let me remind you that you can get all the studies that were submitted today for you to download in cioteca.caf.com. There you will find all the studies that were introduced today during the event. We invite you to be with us in the next edition, the fifth cycle on Wednesday, September the 8th. We'll be talking about fiscal institutions and sustainability of the public debt. All of the information can be found in www.caf.com. On behalf of CAF and on behalf of all participants, we would like to thank you very much for joining us in this event, and we hope you have a beautiful day.